England, 1807. The harbour at Portsmouth smelled of salt, tar, and opportunity. Lady Cecilia Hartley stood at the dock, her travelling cloak pulled tight against the morning wind, watching sailors load cargo onto the merchant vessel that would carry her north to Scotland. In her leather satchel, pressed between volumes of poetry meant to disguise their importance, lay the documents that could either restore her family's honour or seal her fate forever. "You're certain about this passage, my lady?" asked Mrs. Brennan, the elderly widow who had agreed to serve as her companion for the journey. The woman's weathered face showed concern as she surveyed the ship with obvious misgiving. "Quite certain," Cecilia replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. 3 weeks had passed since her father's death, 3 weeks since she had discovered the extent of her cousin Edmund's treachery. The falsified documents, the forged signatures, the manufactured debts that had nearly consumed the Hartley estates. All of it carefully orchestrated by a man she had once trusted. Edmund Fairmont, Lord of Greenton, had wasted no time after the funeral. Within days, he had appeared at Hartley Manor with legal papers demanding she accept his suit or forfeit the remaining properties to satisfy her father's supposed obligations. When Cecilia had refused, when she had shown him the original documents proving the debts were fabricated, his mask of concern had slipped entirely. "You have no proof," he had said, his voice cold as winter stone. "Those papers mean nothing without your father to verify them. Marry me, cousin, and I shall forget this unpleasantness. Refuse, and I shall ensure you have nowhere left to run." But Cecilia had been her father's daughter. While Edmund had been occupied with his solicitors, she had secured copies of the estate records, the banking correspondence, her father's journals documenting Edmund's gradual infiltration of their finances. She had also secured passage on this vessel bound for Edinburgh, where her mother's brother, a respected advocate, could present the evidence to the proper authorities far from Edmund's sphere of influence. "All passengers aboard!" called the ship's mate. "We sail with the tide." Cecilia climbed the gangway, Mrs. Brennan following with considerably less grace. The deck bustled with activity as sailors prepared to cast off, their calls and curses forming a rough symphony she found oddly comforting. Here, at least, she was anonymous. Here, she was simply another passenger seeking transport, not Lady Cecilia Hartley, the impoverished daughter of a disgraced viscount. She had just reached the railing when a commotion near the captain's quarters drew her attention. A tall gentleman was boarding, his dark coat well-tailored but understated, his bearing suggesting nobility despite the absence of obvious trappings. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, yet something in his careful observation of his surroundings spoke of caution rather than arrogance. Their eyes met briefly as he passed. His were a striking shade of blue, dark as the deep ocean, and they seemed to assess her in a single glance before moving on. Cecilia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest and immediately dismissed it. She had no time for such foolishness, not when Edmund's men might even now be searching Portsmouth for her. The ship lurched as the crew hauled up the anchor. Cecilia gripped the railing, watching the dock recede as canvas snapped overhead, catching the wind that would carry them toward the open sea, and, she prayed, towards safety. The first 2 days passed in relative comfort. The weather held fair, and Mrs. Brennan, despite her initial misgivings, proved to be pleasant company. Cecilia spent her time reading on deck when the wind permitted, or in the tiny cabin they shared when it did not. She saw the dark-haired gentleman occasionally, always at a distance, always alone. Once, she noticed him in conversation with the captain, their discussion appearing serious despite their lowered voices. "That one's a curious sort," Mrs. Brennan remarked on the second evening, as they watched the sun paint the horizon in shades of amber and rose. "Travelling without servants, yet the captain treats him with considerable deference. Perhaps he's a naval officer," Cecilia suggested, though something about the man suggested a rank far above that. "Perhaps," Mrs. Brennan agreed, unconvinced. The third day dawned grey and cold. Heavy clouds pressed down upon the water as the ship made its way north along the eastern coast. They had passed the great ports and now sailed through waters where merchant vessels and fishing boats grew scarce. Cecilia was on deck despite the chill, needing air after the stuffiness of the cabin, when Mrs. Brennan appeared at her side, her face pale. "My lady, One of the sailors just told me we're being followed, the older woman whispered urgently. A ship with black sails, gaining on us rapidly. Cecilia's blood ran cold. She turned, scanning the grey expanse behind them, and there, emerging from the morning mist like a phantom, came a vessel under full sail. Even from this distance, she could see its dark canvas, could sense the predatory purpose in its approach. "Pirates!" breathed a sailor nearby, his face ashen. "Spanish raiders! God help us all!" The deck erupted into chaos. The captain shouted orders as crew scrambled to coax more speed from their merchant vessel. But Cecilia could see the futility of it. The pursuing ship was built for speed, designed for exactly this kind of chase. "Below deck!" the captain roared at the passengers. "All of you, below now!" Mrs. Brennan clutched Cecilia's arm, but Cecilia stood frozen, watching the black-sailed ship draw closer. Her mind raced. If these were common pirates seeking cargo, she might survive. But what if Edmund had arranged this? What if these men had orders to find her specifically? The thought seemed paranoid until the pursuing vessel came alongside and she saw the discipline with which the crew operated. These were no desperate brigands. They moved with military precision as they threw grappling hooks across the narrowing gap between ships. "I said below," the captain shouted again, but his voice was drowned by the thunder of boots on deck as armed men swung across from the pirate vessel. The dark-haired gentleman appeared suddenly at Cecilia's side. Up close, she could see the sharp intelligence in those blue eyes, the controlled tension in his stance. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made her obey without question. The pirates swarmed across the deck, their leader striding forward with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before. He was perhaps 40 years of age, his greying hair pulled back, a wicked scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His clothing marked him as Spanish, his bearing as someone accustomed to command. "Good morning, Captain," the pirate said in heavily accented English. "I am Captain Rafael Cortez, and I believe you have something that belongs to my employer." The merchant captain stood his ground despite his obvious fear. "We carry nothing but textiles and grain bound for Edinburgh. Take what you want and be done with it." Cortez smiled, showing teeth. "I want nothing from your hold, Captain. I want the woman." Cecilia's heart stopped. Every eye turned toward her. "What woman?" the captain asked, though his gaze had already found Cecilia. "There are several ladies aboard. The one with brown hair and green eyes," Cortez said, pointing directly at Cecilia. "Lady Cecilia Hartley, daughter of the late Viscount Hartley. I have been hired to retrieve her, and certain documents she stole from her lawful guardian." "I stole nothing," Cecilia heard herself shout, stepping forward despite the dark-haired gentleman's attempt to hold her back. "Those documents are my property, proving my cousin's fraud." Cortez's smile widened. "Ah, there is the spirit I was warned about. Lord Fairmont sends his regards, my lady. He is most eager for your return." "Edmund hired you?" Cecilia demanded, her fear transforming into fury. "He hired pirates to kidnap me." "Lord Fairmont hired me to recover his betrothed and evidence of serious crimes," Cortez corrected smoothly. "Though I admit, the pay is considerably better than my usual work. Now come quietly, and no one else need be harmed." "She's not going anywhere with you," the dark-haired gentleman said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Cortez turned his attention to him for the first time, and something flickered in the pirate's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. "And who might you be to interfere?" Cortez asked, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. The gentleman straightened to his full considerable height. When he spoke, his voice carried across the deck with unmistakable command. "I am Dominic Greymore, Duke of Northmere, and I am placing Lady Cecilia Hartley under my protection as a witness crucial to Crown investigations into smuggling operations along this coast. Operations, Captain Cortez, that we have reason to believe involve Lord Edmund Fairmont." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Cortez's eyes narrowed. "A duke, travelling without escort. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." "Believe what you will," Dominic replied calmly. The fact remains that you are about to commit an act of piracy against a vessel carrying a peer of the realm. I suggest you reconsider your course of action. My employer pays well, Cortez said, though some of the certainty had left his voice. And the lady was promised to me alive, along with her documents. Those are the terms of my contract. Then your employer has sent you on a fool's errand, Dominic said. Because I challenge you, Captain Cortez, to single combat for Lady Cecilia's freedom. A murmur ran through both crews. Even Cortez seemed taken aback. You challenge me? The pirate repeated. A duke challenges a pirate captain to a duel? I do, Dominic confirmed. You and I, swords to first blood or surrender. If you win, you may take Lady Cecilia and depart unmolested. If I win, you release this vessel, all its passengers, and surrender Lady Cecilia's documents to my custody. Those are my terms. Cortez studied him for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. You have courage, Duke. I'll grant you that. Perhaps you are who you claim to be after all. Very well. I accept your challenge. We fight at dawn tomorrow. It will give me time to send word to Lord Fairmont that his prize has attracted unexpected protection. No, Dominic said flatly. We fight now. This moment. Unless you fear facing an English aristocrat without time to prepare. The taunt struck home. Cortez's smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. Around them, his crew stirred, hands moving to weapons, but the pirate captain raised a hand to still them. Very well, Duke, Cortez said softly. We fight now, and when I win, remember that your death is on your own head. He drew his sword in one fluid motion, the blade catching what little light penetrated the grey sky. Dominic removed his coat, handing it to Cecilia without looking at her, his attention never leaving his opponent. Stay back, he murmured to her, no matter what happens. Then he drew his own blade, and the deck of the merchant vessel became an arena where the fate of a woman, a fortune in stolen land, and the honor of a duke would be decided by steel and skill. The deck cleared as if by silent agreement. Crew members from both vessels drew back, forming a rough circle around the two combatants. The morning remained grey and cold, the sea restless beneath the hull, but no one seemed to notice the chill. All eyes fixed on the Duke and the pirate captain as they circled each other, blades raised. Cortez moved first, testing Dominic with a quick thrust that the Duke parried smoothly. Metal rang against metal, the sound sharp in the heavy air. The pirate followed with a series of rapid strikes, each one precise and purposeful, seeking weakness in his opponent's defense. Dominic gave ground, his movements economical and controlled. Cecilia watched from where Mrs. Brennan had pulled her back against the railing, her heart in her throat. She knew nothing of swordplay beyond what she had glimpsed in her brother's fencing lessons years ago, but even she could see the deadly seriousness in both men's faces. He fights well for a nobleman, one of Cortez's crew muttered to his companion, grudging respect in his voice. Captain's better, the other replied, but he sounded less certain than his words suggested. The combatants moved across the deck, their boots finding purchase on the damp wood with practiced ease. Cortez pressed his advantage, driving Dominic back toward the mainmast with a flurry of strikes that seemed impossible to counter. But the Duke met each blow, his blade moving in patterns that spoke of years of training. Then something changed. Dominic stopped retreating. His next parry flowed into a riposte that forced Cortez to leap back, and suddenly the pirate was the one defending. The Duke advanced, his attacks coming faster now, more aggressive, each one precisely calculated to test his opponent's guard. You have been holding back, Cortez panted, genuine surprise in his voice as he blocked a strike that would have disarmed him. I was assessing your skill, Dominic replied calmly, not even breathing hard. I have seen enough. What followed was poetry written in steel. Dominic's blade seemed to be everywhere at once, high then low, left then right, each movement flowing into the next with fluid grace. Cortez met him blow for blow, his experience showing in how he adapted to his opponent's shifting tactics. But the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Cecilia found herself leaning forward despite Mrs. Brennan's restraining hand, unable to look away. There was something mesmerizing in the way Dominic moved, a controlled violence that was somehow beautiful in its efficiency. This was not the careful gentleman she had glimpsed over the past 2 days. This was someone who had fought for his life before and knew exactly what he was doing. A gasp ran through the watching crowd as Dominic's blade slipped past Cortez's guard and opened a shallow cut along the pirate's sword arm. It was barely a wound, more symbolic than damaging, but Cortez's eyes widened with the realization of how close he had come to something far worse. "First blood!" someone called out, but Dominic pressed forward, not allowing his opponent time to regroup. His next sequence of strikes drove Cortez backward until the pirate's shoulders hit the railing. A final swift movement, and Cortez's sword flew from his hand, spinning through the air to clatter across the deck. Silence fell. Dominic's blade rested at Cortez's throat, steady despite the ship's movement. The pirate captain stood very still, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on his opponent's face. "You could have killed me 3 moves ago," Cortez said quietly, understanding dawning in his expression. "When I overextended on that thrust to my left, you deliberately left that opening, waited for me to take it. I needed to know if you were honorable enough to keep your word," Dominic replied, not lowering his blade. "A dead man cannot order his crew to release this vessel." Cortez held his gaze for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. He raised his hands in surrender. "I yield," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the deck. "The Duke of Northmere has won his wager fairly." He turned to his crew. "Release the prisoners. Return the lady's belongings. We sail immediately." A murmur of protest rose from some of the pirates, but Cortez silenced them with a sharp gesture. "I gave my word," he said firmly. "Would you have me break it and shame us all?" He looked back at Dominic. "You have won, Duke. Lady Cecilia is yours to protect. But I warn you, Lord Fairmont is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. He will find other ways to pursue what he believes is his. Let him try," Dominic replied, finally lowering his sword. "The Crown's interest in his activities extends beyond this lady's welfare." Cortez nodded slowly, retrieving his blade from where it had fallen. "I suspected as much. Tell me, did you truly travel without escort, or are there warships following at a discreet distance?" A ghost of a smile touched Dominic's lips. "That, Captain, is information I see no reason to share." The pirate laughed. "Fair enough. Until we meet again, Duke, and I pray that when we do, we are not on opposite sides." He bowed with surprising elegance to Cecilia. "My apologies, Lady Hartley. I am a mercenary, not a monster. I wish you better fortune than your cousin intends." With that, he strode back across the deck, calling orders to his crew. Within minutes, the grappling hooks were withdrawn, the black-sailed vessel was pulling away, and the merchant ship was free once more. Cecilia stood frozen, struggling to process what had just occurred. Dominic turned toward her, and she saw him properly for the first time. His dark hair was dishevelled from the fight, his shirt collar loosened, and there was something in his blue eyes that made her breath catch. This was the man who had just risked his life for a stranger, who had faced down a notorious pirate captain without hesitation. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the intensity that still lingered from the combat. "I am well, Your Grace," Cecilia managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt absurd given the circumstances. "Thanks to you. I cannot begin to express my gratitude." "There is no need for thanks," he replied. "I could not stand by and allow Edmund Fairmont's schemes to succeed." He studied her face more carefully. "You are pale. The shock of the encounter." "I am perfectly fine," Cecilia insisted, though in truth she felt dizzy. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the attack was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Mrs. Brennan appeared at her side, taking her arm. "Come, my lady. You should sit down before you fall down." Cecilia allowed herself to be led to a barrel lashed to the deck, but as she sat, a sharp pain lanced through her left shoulder. She gasped involuntarily, and Dominic was beside her in an instant. "You are injured," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "It is nothing," Cecilia protested. "Merely a bruise from when I fell during the initial attack." "Let me see." "Your Grace, that would be most improper." Dominic's expression softened slightly. "Lady Cecilia, I have just fought a duel on your behalf. I believe we can dispense with certain proprieties long enough to ensure you have not been seriously wounded. Mrs. Brennan may serve as chaperone." The older woman nodded firmly. "He's right, my lady. Let him look." Reluctantly, Cecilia loosened her cloak. When Dominic eased back the fabric of her dress at the shoulder, they all saw the blood soaking through her chemise. Not a great deal, but enough to prove this was no simple bruise. "A bullet grazed you," Dominic said, his voice tight with concern. "During the boarding. Why did you not say something immediately?" "There was the duel," Cecilia replied weakly. "It seemed unimportant." "Unimportant," he repeated, something between exasperation and admiration in his tone. He turned to the merchant captain, who had been hovering nearby. "How far to the nearest port?" "Berwick-upon-Tweed is perhaps 6 hours north, your grace. We can make it by evening if the wind holds." "Then set course immediately." Dominic looked back at Cecilia. "I have some medical knowledge from my time in the Peninsular campaigns. With your permission, I will clean and bind the wound properly when we reach port." Cecilia nodded, too tired suddenly to argue. The pain in her shoulder was growing worse, a hot throbbing that spread down her arm. She watched as Dominic retrieved his coat and draped it around her shoulders over her cloak, the wool still warm from his body. The hours that followed passed in a blur. Cecilia remained on deck despite Mrs. Brennan's urging to rest below, unwilling to retreat to the suffocating cabin. Dominic stayed nearby, not hovering, but close enough that she found his presence oddly comforting. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the port of Berwick-upon-Tweed came into view, the town straddling the border between England and Scotland. The merchant vessel made port as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Dominic secured rooms at a respectable inn near the harbour, paying the proprietor handsomely to ensure discretion. Mrs. Brennan settled Cecilia in a small but clean chamber, helping her out of her travelling dress, while Dominic waited in the hall. When he entered, carrying a basin of hot water and clean linen that the innkeeper's wife had provided, his expression was professionally detached. He examined the wound with gentle efficiency, his touch careful as he cleaned away the dried blood. "You were fortunate," he said quietly. "The bullet barely broke the skin, but it has become inflamed from neglect and the sea air. I am going to apply a poultice, and you must keep it clean and dry for several days." "I have no time for several days," Cecilia protested. "I must reach Edinburgh before Edmund discovers where I have gone." "Edmund already knows where you were going," Dominic replied, mixing herbs from a small kit he carried into a paste. "He hired Cortez to intercept you. Your original plan is compromised." The truth of his words struck her forcefully. She sagged back against the pillows Mrs. Brennan had arranged, feeling tears of frustration prick at her eyes. "Then what am I to do?" she whispered. "The documents I carry are the only proof of his fraud. Without them, I have nothing. With them but no safe destination, I am simply a target." Dominic finished binding the wound and sat back, regarding her thoughtfully. "That is something we shall discuss when you have recovered. For now, you need rest. Mrs. Brennan will sit with you." But rest proved elusive. By midnight, Cecilia was burning with fever, her body's response to the wound and the day's trauma overwhelming her depleted reserves. She tossed restlessly, caught in nightmares where Edmund's face loomed over her, where pirates with black sails chased her across endless grey seas. Through the delirium, she was dimly aware of cool cloths on her forehead, of gentle hands turning her when she became tangled in the bedclothes, of a deep voice speaking quietly nearby. Sometimes it was Mrs. Brennan's worn face she glimpsed when she surfaced briefly toward consciousness. Other times it was Dominic's features, his expression concerned despite the calm in his voice. "The estates," she heard herself mumbling at one point. Father tried to stop him, but Edmund was too clever. The forgeries, the false debts. He took everything. "Hush now," came Dominic's voice, steady and reassuring. "You are safe. No one will harm you here. He wants to marry me," she continued, the words spilling out in her fevered state. "Says it is the only way to protect the family name. But he killed Father. I know he did. The physician said it was his heart. But I saw the tea Edmund brought him every evening. I saw how Father grew weaker after each cup." There was silence, Then the Duke's voice again, carefully neutral. Can you prove this? Father's journals, Cecilia whispered. He documented everything. The dates, the amounts Edmund stole. He suspected poison, but could not bring himself to believe his own nephew capable of such evil. I have the journals, with my things, the leather satchel. She felt, rather than saw him move away, heard low voices in conversation. Then darkness claimed her again, and she sank into sleep that was finally, blessedly dreamless. When Cecilia woke, pale morning light filtered through the inn's small window. Her head ached, and her shoulder throbbed, but the fever had broken. She lay still for a moment, taking stock of her surroundings and slowly piecing together memories of the previous day. The door opened quietly, and Dominic entered, carrying a tray. He stopped when he saw her eyes open, and something that might have been relief crossed his features. You are awake, he observed. How do you feel? As though I have been trampled by horses, Cecilia admitted, but clearer in mind than I have been. Your Grace, I must apologize. I fear I may have said things during my fever that were quite improper. You said many things, Dominic replied, setting the tray on a small table and pouring tea, none of which were improper, though much of it was deeply concerning. He brought the cup to her bedside. Can you sit? With Mrs. Brennan's help, Cecilia managed to prop herself up against the pillows. She accepted the tea gratefully, the hot liquid soothing her parched throat. How long have I been ill? She asked. 2 days, Dominic replied. Your fever finally broke early this morning. Mrs. Brennan and I have been taking turns sitting with you. 2 days. Cecilia closed her eyes briefly. 2 days during which Edmund might have discovered her location, might already have men on the way to Berwick. Lady Cecilia, Dominic said gently, drawing her attention back to him. I must be honest with you about something. I told you I was travelling incognito to investigate smuggling operations along this coast. That was true. What I did not tell you was that Edmund Fairmont has been under Crown surveillance for months. His connections to smugglers, his financial dealings, his sudden acquisition of the Hartley properties, all of it raised questions we have been quietly investigating. Cecilia stared at him. You knew about Edmund before we met on the ship. I knew he was a person of interest, Dominic confirmed. I did not know the full extent of his crimes against your family until I heard what you revealed during your delirium. Now I need to ask your permission to examine the documents you carry. The journals your father kept, the financial records, anything that might provide evidence we can use against Edmund legally. He met her gaze steadily. I understand you have no reason to trust me beyond the fact that I fought for your freedom, but I am asking you to take that leap of faith. Let me see what proof you have. Let me help you bring Edmund to justice in a way that will stand up in a court of law. Cecilia studied his face, the strong features that somehow managed to convey both authority and genuine concern. He had risked his life for her. He had tended her wounds and sat vigil through her fever. Either he was the finest actor she had ever encountered, or he was precisely what he claimed to be, a man of honor trying to stop a dangerous criminal. The leather satchel, she said quietly. Mrs. Brennan knows where I keep it. Everything is there. The deed forgeries, the falsified debts, father's journals documenting Edmund's crimes. Even my suspicions about the poisoning, though I admit those are based more on observation than proof. Dominic nodded slowly. Thank you for your trust. I will review everything carefully, and I give you my word that these documents will be used only to pursue justice against Edmund, never against you or your family's interests. Mrs. Brennan produced the satchel from where she had hidden it beneath her own belongings. Dominic accepted it, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked back at Cecilia. You mentioned Edinburgh as your original destination. Your mother's brother, I presume. My uncle, yes. Malcolm Dunbar. He is an advocate, well respected in Scotland. I thought he could present the evidence to authorities there, far from Edmund's influence in London. A sound plan, Dominic agreed. But Cortez's attack proves that Edmund anticipated this move. He will have men watching Edinburgh as well. He paused. I have a different proposal. Come with me to London. Let me present this evidence to the proper authorities there, where I have connections that can ensure it receives the attention it deserves. Edmund may have friends in London, but I have the authority of the crown behind me." "London," Cecilia repeated softly, "where Edmund has spent years building his political connections." "Where he also has enemies," Dominic countered. "Men whose own interests have been damaged by his schemes, who would be delighted to see him brought down if given sufficient evidence. You cannot hide from Edmund forever, Lady Cecilia. Eventually you must stand and fight. I am offering you the resources to do so effectively." Cecilia looked down at her hands, at the simple dress she wore, at the bandaged shoulder that ached with every breath. 2 weeks ago, she had been planning what meagre entertainments she might afford for the coming season. Now she was hiding in a border town, wounded and hunted, with only the protection of a duke she barely knew standing between her and a man who had already destroyed her father. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, meeting his eyes. "You say Edmund is under investigation, but surely that would proceed whether I cooperate or not. Why risk yourself? Why involve yourself in my troubles so completely?" Dominic was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful experience. "Because when I was your age, I watched a man much like Edmund destroy my mother's family through legal manipulation and political connections. I was too young then, without the rank or resources to stop him. My mother died believing her family had simply failed, never knowing they had been deliberately ruined. I swore then that if I ever had the power to prevent such injustice, I would use it. You have given me that opportunity, Lady Cecilia. Let me help you." There was no false charm in his words, no practiced seduction, only simple honesty and perhaps a touch of old pain that he rarely allowed others to see. In that moment, Cecilia made her choice. "Very well, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I place myself and my father's legacy under your protection. Take me to London." The journey to London took 5 days by carriage, following the Great North Road south through the heart of England. Dominic had arranged for a well-sprung vehicle and fresh horses at every posting inn, ensuring Cecilia's comfort despite her still healing shoulder. Mrs. Brennan accompanied them as chaperone, though the older woman spent much of the journey dozing in her corner of the carriage, leaving Cecilia and the Duke to conversation. On the first day they spoke little beyond necessities. Cecilia was still weak from her fever, and Dominic seemed content to allow her the silence to recover. He spent the hours reviewing the documents from her father's satchel, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read through page after page of evidence documenting Edmund's systematic destruction of the Hartley estate. "Your father was meticulous," he observed as they stopped to change horses at a posting inn near Durham. Every transaction documented, every discrepancy noted. He knew what Edmund was doing, even if he could not bring himself to confront it directly. "Father was a gentle man," Cecilia said quietly, accepting the cup of tea the innkeeper's wife brought them. "He wanted to believe the best of people, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Edmund was his late sister's only child. I think father felt responsible for him after she died in childbirth." "Edmund clearly did not share that familial sentiment," Dominic replied. "These forgeries are elaborate. He must have been planning this scheme for years." D. The second day brought clearer weather and Cecilia's returning strength. As the countryside rolled past the carriage windows, she found herself observing the Duke with growing curiosity. He was not what she had expected from the stories she had heard of powerful nobles. There was none of the casual arrogance she associated with his rank, no assumption of superiority. Instead, she saw a man who carried his position with quiet competence and what appeared to be genuine concern for justice. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she ventured as they passed through the town of York. "You may," he replied, setting aside the journal he had been reading. "And please, when we are private like this, my given name is Dominic. I find excessive formality exhausting on long journeys." "Dominic, then," Cecilia said, testing the name on her tongue. "Why have you never married? Surely a man of your position has been pursued by every ambitious mother in London." A rueful smile touched his lips. "I have indeed been pursued, though perhaps not for the reasons those mothers imagine. The title is ancient and the estates are profitable, but the position comes with responsibilities that few understand. A duke does not simply attend balls and collect rents. I sit in Parliament. I oversee the welfare of thousands of people who depend on Northmere lands for their livelihoods. I serve the crown in matters that often require discretion and sacrifice. He looked out the window at the passing fields. I watched my father dedicate his entire life to duty, leaving little room for personal happiness. My mother was a gentle soul who deserved better than the isolated existence she endured as his Duchess. When she died when I was 16, father scarcely paused in his work. The estates required attention. Parliament was in session. Obligations must be met. I learned then that a duke's wife must be prepared to live in the shadow of those obligations, and I have never met a woman I felt could endure such a life willingly. You protect potential wives from yourself, Cecilia observed softly. How noble and how lonely. Dominic turned back to her, something shifting in his blue eyes. You understand then. Most assume I am simply too particular or too cold to form attachments. I understand duty that consumes personal desire, Cecilia replied. My father needed me after mother died. My younger brother Charles was only 10 years old when she passed in childbirth with what would have been his sister. The baby died as well. Father retreated into his grief, and someone had to manage the household, oversee Charles's education, maintain what remained of our social connections. I was 12 years old, hardly prepared for such responsibility, but there was no one else. You raised your brother while still a child yourself, Dominic said, understanding dawning. What happened to him? Pain crossed Cecilia's face. Fever, 3 years ago. He was 17, preparing for Oxford. It started as a simple cold, and within a week he was gone. Father never recovered from losing both mother and son. I think his heart was already broken before Edmund's schemes began draining what remained of his will to live. They sat in silence for a moment, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the road, the only sound. I am sorry for your losses, Dominic said finally. To lose your mother, brother, and father in such succession. That is a grief few could bear. We all bear what we must, Cecilia replied, echoing his earlier words about duty. The third day brought rain that turned the roads to mud and forced them to slow their pace. Confined to the carriage as water streamed down the windows, they talked more deeply than propriety would normally allow between near strangers. Dominic spoke of his years at Cambridge, of friendships formed and lost, of the weight that had settled on his shoulders when his father died, and the title passed to him at age 28. I was not prepared, he admitted. Father had always been so vital, so commanding. I assumed I had decades to learn from him. Instead, I had 3 months between his diagnosis and his death. 3 months to absorb what he had spent 50 years perfecting. Yet you succeeded, Cecilia pointed out. From what I have heard, the Northmere estates are among the best managed in England. Through trial and considerable error, Dominic replied wryly. And with help from good people who were patient with a young duke who thought he knew everything and actually knew very little. Cecilia found herself smiling. That is a humility few nobles possess. Perhaps I simply learned it through necessity rather than virtue. By the 4th day, they had entered the southern counties, and London loomed ever closer. The easy conversation that had developed between them grew more focused as they discussed the strategy for presenting evidence against Edmund. The Lord Chancellor will need to review the documents personally, Dominic explained as they passed through Hertfordshire. But first, I must report to certain members of the Privy Council about the attempt on your life and Cortez's involvement. The attack on a peer's daughter by hired pirates constitutes a serious matter that goes beyond simple estate fraud. Will they believe me? Cecilia asked, voicing the fear that had gnawed at her since agreeing to this plan. Edmund has spent years building his reputation in London. I am merely the daughter of an obscure viscount from a failing estate. You are the victim of a criminal conspiracy, Dominic corrected firmly. And you have evidence that will speak louder than Edmund's reputation. Moreover, you have my testimony regarding the pirate attack and my status as a witness to your character. A character you have known for less than a week, Cecilia pointed out. A week in which you have shown remarkable courage, intelligence, and integrity, Dominic replied. Those qualities do not develop overnight. They are formed over years of facing adversity with dignity. Anyone who meets you will recognize that. His confidence steadied her, though she could not quite shake her apprehension about what awaited in London. They arrived in the capital as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. The city sprawled before them, larger and more overwhelming than Cecilia remembered from her one brief visit years ago. The streets teemed with carriages, vendors, pedestrians going about their business in the perpetual motion that characterized London life. Dominic directed the carriage to his townhouse in Mayfair, a stately building of honey-coloured stone that spoke of old wealth and established position. But as they turned onto his street, Cecilia noticed a figure standing near the entrance, a man in the livery of a messenger. "Your Grace," the man said, stepping forward as soon as Dominic emerged from the carriage. "I was sent to watch for your arrival. There is urgent news regarding Lord Edmund Fairmont." Dominic's expression sharpened. "What news?" "He has been in London for the past week, Your Grace. He has made formal complaint to the magistrates that his ward, Lady Cecilia Hartley, was abducted from Portsmouth by unknown parties. He is claiming she was kidnapped to prevent her marriage to him, which he says was arranged by her late father to settle estate debts." Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. "He is claiming I was taken against my will. More than that, my lady," the messenger continued, his expression sympathetic. "He has spread rumours throughout society that you ran off with a lover, abandoning your obligations to your family name. The scandal sheets have been speculating for days about the identity of your supposed paramour." "Of course he has," Dominic said grimly. "Attack your victim's character before she can defend herself. A classic strategy." He helped Cecilia down from the carriage. "Come inside. We must plan our response carefully." Within the elegant confines of Dominic's study, they reviewed the situation. Mrs. Brennan had been taken to guest quarters to rest. Cecilia would have followed, but before she allowed herself that mercy, she wrote a brief letter to her uncle, Malcolm Dunbar, in Edinburgh, assuring him she was safe and asking him to hold himself ready should the matter require Scottish counsel. Then she joined the Duke to discuss strategy over tea that neither of them touched. "Edmund has moved faster than I anticipated," Dominic admitted, pacing before the fireplace. "By establishing his version of events first, he puts us on the defensive. Can we not simply present the documents to the authorities?" Cecilia asked. "We will, but now we must also combat the damage to your reputation. If Edmund has successfully painted you as a runaway bride or worse, some will be inclined to dismiss anything you say as the desperate fabrications of a woman trying to avoid her obligations." A knock at the door interrupted them. The butler entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, Lady Margaret Greymore has arrived. She says it is urgent that she speak with you immediately." "Show her in," Dominic said, and moments later, a striking woman in her early 30s swept into the study. Lady Margaret Greymore shared her brother's dark colouring and aristocratic features, though where Dominic's manner was measured and controlled, Margaret radiated barely contained energy. She stopped short when she saw Cecilia, her blue eyes sharp with assessment. "So this is the mysterious Lady Hartley," she said without preamble. "The woman whose supposed abduction has set all of London buzzing. I came as soon as I heard you had returned to town, Dominic. What in heaven's name have you gotten yourself involved in? The prevention of a serious injustice." Dominic replied calmly. "Margaret, allow me to properly introduce Lady Cecilia Hartley, daughter of the late Viscount Hartley. Cecilia, my sister Margaret, Countess of Westfield." Margaret dropped into a perfunctory curtsy, her gaze never leaving Cecilia's face. "Are you truly being pursued by your cousin, or is that Edmund Fairmont's invention?" "My cousin is pursuing the Hartley estates, which he has systematically stolen through fraud and forgery," Cecilia replied, meeting the Countess's direct stare with her own. "I am merely an inconvenient obstacle to his complete control of properties that rightfully belong to me." "And the lover?" "The scandal about running away. A complete fabrication designed to destroy my credibility before I can present evidence of his crimes." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then looked at her brother. "You believe her?" "I have reviewed her father's documentation," Dominic said. "The evidence is compelling. More than that, Edmund hired a Spanish pirate captain to abduct Cecilia from the ship she was taking to Scotland. I witnessed the attack personally. His sister's eyebrows rose. Pirates? Dominic, this sounds like something from a Gothic novel. I assure you it was quite real, he replied dryly. I have already sent word to the naval authorities about Captain Cortez's activities. They are searching for him now. Margaret sank into a chair, processing this information. Let me understand this correctly. You fought pirates, rescued a damsel in distress, brought her to London under your protection, and now expect society to accept that your relationship is entirely proper. I expect society to recognize an attempt at justice when they see one, Dominic said firmly. You expect far too much of society, Margaret countered. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London will be buzzing with speculation that you are the mysterious lover. Your enemies will use this to undermine your political influence. My enemies can go hang, Dominic replied with uncharacteristic vehemence. I will not abandon Lady Cecilia to Edmund's machinations simply to preserve my social standing. Margaret looked between them, something calculating in her expression. You care for her. I care about justice. That is not what I asked. Brother and sister locked eyes for a moment, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Margaret sighed. Very well. If you are determined to pursue this course, you will need help. Let me see these famous documents that are worth risking your reputation over. For the next hour, Margaret reviewed the evidence Cecilia had brought from Hartley Manor. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she read through her father's careful documentation of Edmund's crimes. This is damning, she said finally, setting down the last journal. But Dominic is right. Edmund has already poisoned public opinion against you. We will need to be strategic about how we proceed. What do you suggest? Cecilia asked. Margaret tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair, thinking. First, we establish that you are not hiding in shame but have returned to London voluntarily to address false accusations. Dominic will escort you to make formal statements to the proper authorities very publicly. Second, I will use my social connections to quietly spread the truth about Edmund's schemes. London society loves nothing better than discovering they have been deceived, and several influential ladies owe me favours. Third, we present you at carefully selected social events where your dignity and composure can counteract the rumours of scandalous behaviour. You would help me? Cecilia asked, surprised. We have only just met. I am helping my brother, Margaret corrected. Though I confess, having read your father's journals, I find myself rather impressed by your courage in confronting Edmund. That took considerable strength of character. Thank you, Cecilia said softly. Do not thank me yet, Margaret warned. The path ahead will not be easy. Society can be cruel, especially to women whose reputations have been questioned. You will face cut direct, snide comments, invitations withdrawn. Are you prepared for that? Cecilia thought of her father dying alone, of Edmund's cold smile as he had tried to force her into marriage, of Captain Cortez's men boarding the ship with violence in their eyes. I have faced worse than social disapproval, she said quietly. I can endure whatever is necessary. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her severe features into something almost warm. I believe you can. Very well, Lady Cecilia. You have yourself an ally. Over the next few days, Dominic set his plan into motion. He arranged meetings with key members of the Privy Council, presenting Cecilia's evidence along with his own testimony about the pirate attack. He also filed formal reports with the naval authorities about Cortez's involvement, providing descriptions and last known positions that would aid in the captain's capture. Meanwhile, Cecilia was installed in a small but respectable property Dominic owned on the outskirts of London, close enough to be accessible, but far enough to provide some privacy from prying eyes. Mrs. Brennan remained with her as companion and chaperone, while Margaret became a frequent visitor, coaching Cecilia on navigating the treacherous social waters ahead. Edmund will not take your return lying down, Margaret warned during one of these visits. He will escalate, try to discredit you further. Be prepared for attacks from unexpected quarters. The warning proved prophetic. Within a week of Cecilia's arrival in London, Edmund made his next move, presenting a witness who claimed to have seen Cecilia accepting money from suspicious foreigners in Portsmouth. The implication was clear. She was not fleeing persecution, but engaging in some form of criminal conspiracy, possibly even treason given the current tensions with France. The accusation sent shockwaves through London society. Treason was no mere social scandal, but a capital crime. If Edmund could make such charges stick, Cecilia faced not simply ruin, but potential execution. Dominic's response was swift and methodical. Using his connections within the intelligence services, he had the witness investigated and quickly discovered that the man was deeply in debt to Edmund. Under questioning by Crown agents, the witness admitted he had been paid to provide false testimony and had never actually seen Cecilia before being shown her portrait by Edmund. The revelation should have vindicated Cecilia, but the damage to her reputation was severe. Even with the witness discredited, whispers persisted. Where there was smoke, society reasoned, there must be fire. If Edmund was willing to go to such lengths to discredit her, perhaps there was some truth to the underlying accusations, if not the specific details. It was during this tense period that Dominic received word that changed everything. Captain Rafael Cortez had been captured by the Royal Navy off the coast of Spain. The pirate captain, facing charges of attacks on British shipping, had decided cooperation was preferable to the gallows. He was providing detailed testimony about his various employers, including his contract with Edmund Fairmont to abduct Lady Cecilia Hartley. "This is precisely what we need," Dominic told Cecilia when he brought her the news. "Cortez's testimony, combined with your father's documents, creates an unassailable case against Edmund. But will it restore my reputation?" Cecilia asked quietly. "Even if Edmund is exposed as a criminal, the stain on my name may never fully wash away." Dominic was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard before. "There is one way to ensure your reputation is protected beyond any possibility of further attack," he said carefully. "It would require considerable trust on your part and a willingness to enter into an arrangement that would dramatically alter both our lives." Cecilia looked up at him, reading something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew his answer. Before Dominic could elaborate on his proposed arrangement, a sharp knock interrupted them. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed from hurrying. "The Council of Dukes has summoned you, Dominic," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow morning. They want to discuss your involvement with Lady Hartley and how it affects your political standing." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Let them discuss what they wish. My actions have been entirely proper." "Proper perhaps, but politically damaging," Margaret replied. "You know how this works. Association with scandal, however unjust, weakens your influence in Parliament. They will pressure you to distance yourself from Lady Hartley. Then they will be disappointed," Dominic said flatly. Margaret glanced at Cecilia, then back at her brother. "May I speak with you privately? Anything you wish to say can be said in Lady Cecilia's presence," Dominic replied. His sister sighed. "Very well. Dominic, I know you feel responsible for her welfare, but you must consider the broader implications. If you lose your political allies over this matter, you lose your ability to effect change in Parliament. The reform bills you have been championing, the improvements to working conditions for factory labourers, the restrictions on child chimney sweeps, all of that requires political capital you are rapidly spending on defending a woman you barely know." "I know her well enough," Dominic said quietly. Cecilia stood abruptly. "Perhaps Lady Margaret is right. I should not be the cause of destroying everything you have worked to build. There must be another way to pursue Edmund without compromising your position." "There is no other way that guarantees your safety," Dominic replied, turning to face her. "Edmund has proven he will stop at nothing. False witnesses, hired pirates, accusations of treason. What will he attempt next? And who besides someone of my rank and resources can stand against him effectively? But at what cost to yourself?" Cecilia asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I will not be responsible for ruining you, not after you have sacrificed so much already." The emotion in her words hung in the air between them. Margaret observed the exchange with growing understanding, her expression softening. "I see," she said quietly. "This is not merely about justice anymore, is it?" Neither Dominic nor Cecilia answered, but the silence spoke volumes. Over the following 3 months, a delicate dance unfolded. Dominic attended his summons before the Council of Dukes and endured their censure with stoic dignity. He refused to abandon his support of Cecilia, but he also demonstrated through careful maneuvering that his political effectiveness had not diminished. He brokered compromises on contentious legislation, leveraged his relationships to advance important reforms, and proved that his judgment remained sound despite the personal scandal swirling around him. During this time, Cecilia remained in the property Dominic had provided, but he visited daily. Sometimes they discussed strategy for the legal proceedings against Edmund. More often, they simply talked, sharing thoughts on literature, politics, philosophy. Dominic brought her books from his extensive library, and she surprised him with the breadth and depth of her reading. "You have studied more widely than many men educated at university," he observed one afternoon, as they debated the merits of various approaches to agricultural reform. "My father believed education was essential regardless of gender," Cecilia replied. "After mother died and I became responsible for managing the household, he ensured I understood economics, law, estate management. He said a woman who could not think critically was at the mercy of every man who sought to control her." "Your father was wiser than he knew," Dominic said. "That education may well be what saves the Hartley legacy." Margaret became a frequent visitor as well, initially viewing her role as chaperone and social advisor. But as she spent more time with Cecilia, genuine friendship developed between the two women. Margaret taught Cecilia the subtle arts of navigating high society, while Cecilia's quiet strength and moral clarity impressed the Countess. "You are nothing like the vapid debutantes I usually encounter," Margaret told Cecilia one afternoon, as they took tea in the small garden behind the house. "Most of them can barely string together 3 coherent thoughts beyond fashion and gossip. You actually have opinions and the intelligence to defend them. Is that a compliment or an observation?" Cecilia asked with a slight smile. "Both," Margaret admitted. "I confess, when Dominic first brought you to London, I thought you would be like all the others who have pursued him over the years. Women who wanted the title and the fortune, but had no understanding of the man himself. I am not pursuing your brother," Cecilia said carefully. "No, you are not," Margaret agreed, "which is precisely why he is falling in love with you." Cecilia's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Lady Margaret, that is hardly appropriate." "Perhaps not, but it is true nonetheless," Margaret replied calmly. "I have known my brother his entire life. I have seen him manage his responsibilities with admirable dedication, but never with joy. These past months, watching him with you, I have seen something different. He looks forward to his visits here. He smiles more readily. He speaks of the future with anticipation rather than mere obligation. He is simply pleased that the case against Edmund is progressing," Cecilia protested, though her heart raced at Margaret's words. "The case against Edmund would progress whether you discussed it daily or weekly," Margaret countered. "Dominic comes here every day because he wants to be near you, and unless I am very much mistaken, you feel similarly about him." Cecilia looked away, unable to meet the Countess's knowing gaze. "My feelings are irrelevant. Even if Edmund is convicted, and my reputation partially restored, I remain the daughter of a disgraced viscount from a bankrupt estate. Your brother is a duke. The social gulf between us is insurmountable." "Only if you allow it to be," Margaret said quietly. "Dominic has never cared over much for social expectations. If he chooses to marry for affection and partnership, rather than political advantage, who in society could truly criticize him? He has served the crown faithfully, managed his estates brilliantly, and dedicated himself to the public good. If any man has earned the right to choose his own bride, surely it is he." Before Cecilia could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a carriage arriving. Through the window, they saw Dominic emerging, his expression grim. "Something has happened," Margaret observed, rising quickly. They met him in the entrance hall, where he was already removing his gloves with sharp, agitated movements. "Edmund has made another move," he said without preamble. "He has petitioned the courts to have you declared mentally incompetent, claiming your accusations against him are evidence of hysteria brought on by the trauma of your father's death. He is seeking to have himself appointed as your legal guardian with authority over your person and property. Cecilia felt the room tilt. He cannot do that. I am of age, in full possession of my faculties. He has found physicians willing to testify otherwise, Dominic said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Men he has paid to claim that your behaviour, fleeing to Scotland, making wild accusations against your own family, demonstrates mental instability requiring intervention. But we have proof of his crimes, Cecilia protested. Your father's documents, Cortez's testimony, which Edmund claims are either forgeries you created during your supposed mental decline or documents you have misinterpreted due to your unstable state, Dominic explained. It is a clever strategy. If the court believes you are not in your right mind, nothing you say carries weight, and as your appointed guardian, Edmund would have legal authority over those very documents. Margaret swore quietly, a breach of propriety that demonstrated the severity of the situation. When is the hearing? 3 weeks, Dominic replied. The magistrate has agreed to hear arguments from both sides. Then we have 3 weeks to demonstrate that Lady Cecilia is perfectly sane and Edmund is the one engaged in criminal deception, Margaret said firmly. Over the following days, they mounted their defence. Dominic arranged for respected physicians to examine Cecilia and provide written testimony to her sound mental state. Margaret hosted a small dinner party, inviting influential members of society to observe Cecilia's composure and intelligence firsthand. Letters were gathered from people who had known Cecilia before her father's death, attesting to her character and competence. But the strain of Edmund's relentless attacks was taking its toll. Cecilia found herself waking in the night, heart pounding, imagining what would happen if Edmund succeeded in having her declared incompetent. She would be entirely in his power, unable to resist whatever he chose to do. It was during one of these sleepless nights, as she sat by the window watching the stars, that she heard a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Dominic standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. I saw your light, he said quietly. I could not sleep either, and was walking in the garden when I noticed your window. May I come in? Mrs. Brennan can serve as chaperone if you wish. Mrs. Brennan is fast asleep and snoring quite impressively, Cecilia replied with a tired smile. But you may come in if you promise we are not doing anything that would give society further ammunition against us. He entered, and they sat in the 2 chairs by the window, the night settling around them like a familiar blanket. Are you frightened? He asked after a moment. Terrified, Cecilia admitted. Edmund has countered every move we have made. What if he succeeds this time? What if the magistrate believes his physicians over ours? Then we will appeal to higher courts, Dominic said firmly. And if necessary, I will use every resource at my disposal, every political connection, every legal mechanism available to prevent Edmund from gaining control over you. You cannot sacrifice everything for me, Cecilia said, the words she had been holding back for weeks finally spilling out. Margaret told me about the pressure you are facing from the Council of Dukes, about the political alliances you are jeopardizing. You have worked your entire life to build your influence, to create change through your position. I cannot be the reason you lose all of that. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you on that ship? He asked. I thought, here is a woman traveling alone with minimal protection, carrying herself with dignity despite obvious fear. Here is someone who refuses to be defeated by circumstances that would crush most people. And then when Cortez attacked, when you stood your ground and denounced him despite the very real danger, I thought, this is someone worth fighting for. He turned to face her. These past 3 months, I have come to know you, Cecilia. Your intelligence, your strength, your compassion for those less fortunate. The way you speak about wanting to restore the Hartley estates, not for your own enrichment, but to provide for the tenants who depended on your father. The thoughtfulness with which you approach every problem, considering not just immediate solutions, but long-term consequences. Dominic, she whispered, but he continued. I have spent my entire adult life convinced that duty and personal happiness were incompatible, that a duke must sacrifice the latter for the former. But you have made me question that assumption. What if duty and happiness can coexist? What if the right partnership makes both possible? What are you saying? Cecilia asked, though her heart already knew. I am saying that I want to marry you, Dominic replied simply. Not as a strategic maneuver to protect your reputation, though it would accomplish that. Not as a political alliance, though it would end Edmund's ability to claim guardianship over you. I want to marry you because in 3 months you have become essential to my happiness in a way I did not think possible. Tears spilled down Cecilia's cheeks. You would be ruined socially. A duke does not marry the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt viscount. A duke marries whomever he chooses, Dominic corrected gently. And I choose you if you will have me. I offer you not simply my name and protection, but partnership, a true marriage where your thoughts and opinions matter, where your intelligence is valued, where we face the challenges of our positions together. The Council of Dukes will never accept it, Cecilia said, even as hope flared painfully in her chest. The Council of Dukes can go hang, Dominic replied with sudden, fierce emotion. I have given my entire life to duty, Cecilia. For once, I choose something for myself. I choose you. She looked at him through her tears, seeing the man who had risked his life fighting pirates for a stranger, who had sat vigil through her fever, who had defended her against false accusations and social condemnation, the man who had somehow, impossibly, come to mean more to her than safety or reputation, or anything else society valued. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that transformed his face was worth every scandal, every whispered rumor, every social slight she had endured. He reached for her hand, and she gave it freely, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing around hers. There will be consequences, he warned softly. Edmund will escalate. Society will be merciless. We will face opposition from quarters we have not yet imagined. I know, Cecilia replied, but we will face it together. They sat in the darkness, hands joined, planning a future that seemed both terrifyingly uncertain and impossibly bright. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the street below, Edmund Fairmont's hired man taking careful note of the Duke's late-night visit to Lady Cecilia's chambers, evidence that would soon make its way back to his employer, fueling one final desperate gambit to destroy the woman who had defied him and claim what he believed was rightfully his. The morning after Dominic's proposal, Cecilia woke with a sensation she had not experienced in months: hope. Despite all the obstacles that lay ahead, despite Edmund's continued threats and society's disapproval, she felt as though a weight had lifted from her chest. She was no longer alone in this fight. Margaret arrived mid-morning, her expression a mixture of exasperation and affection as she swept into the small drawing room where Cecilia was reviewing correspondence. My brother came to see me at an unconscionably early hour this morning, Margaret announced without preamble. He informed me that he has proposed marriage to you and that you have accepted. He also informed me that I am not to argue with him about it, as his mind is quite made up. Ah, are you here to argue anyway? Cecilia asked carefully. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then her stern expression softened into a genuine smile. No, I am here to welcome you to the family and to help you prepare for what comes next. If Dominic is determined to marry you, and you are equally determined to accept him, then the least I can do is ensure you are both equipped to weather the storm. Relief flooded through Cecilia. Thank you, Lady Margaret. Your support means more than you know. It is simply Margaret now, the Countess replied, sitting down and accepting the tea Cecilia poured. We are to be sisters, after all. Though I must warn you, the next few weeks will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Dominic's decision to marry against the advice of the Council of Dukes will have political ramifications. There will be those who seek to use his choice to undermine his influence. I know, Cecilia said quietly. He explained the consequences. I offered to release him from the engagement, but he refused. Of course he did, Margaret said, with a slight smile. My brother is many things, but once he commits to a course of action, he does not waver. It is both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. They spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements. The engagement would be announced formally, but the wedding itself would be kept relatively private to minimize opportunities for disruption. Margaret would serve as Cecilia's sponsor in society, using her own considerable influence to smooth the way for acceptance of the match. Some will never accept you, Margaret warned honestly. Those who cling to rigid notions of social hierarchy or who have political reasons to oppose Dominic. But many others will follow his lead if we manage this correctly. A duke's wife holds considerable power of her own, Cecilia. You must learn to wield it effectively. I am accustomed to managing an estate and household, Cecilia replied. Surely the principles are similar. The principles, perhaps, but the scale is vastly different, Margaret said. Northmere encompasses 12 estates across 5 counties, with hundreds of families dependent upon ducal patronage and protection. Beyond that, there are social obligations, political responsibilities, charitable work expected of a duchess. It is no small undertaking. I understand, Cecilia said, though the magnitude of what she was accepting began to sink in more fully. I will learn whatever is necessary. I have no doubt you will, Margaret replied warmly. Now, Dominic mentioned that you have an appointment with his solicitors this afternoon to review the legal proceedings against Edmund. I should accompany you. 2 women travelling together will attract less notice than if you went alone or with my brother. The appointment was scheduled for 3 o'clock at the offices of Messrs. Crawford and Pembroke in the city. The solicitors had been preparing the formal case against Edmund, organising the evidence from Cecilia's father's documents, alongside testimony from various witnesses who had suffered from Edmund's schemes. Margaret's carriage arrived promptly at 2:30, and they set out through London's crowded streets. The day was grey and cold, typical for late autumn, and a fine mist hung in the air that would likely turn to rain by evening. They were passing through a less populated area near Lincoln's Inn Fields, when their carriage suddenly lurched to a halt. A man in a plain dark coat had stepped into the road waving a folded paper stamped with a red seal, and the driver, thinking it some urgent summons, pulled the horses up short. Before either woman could question what authority would stop a countess's carriage so abruptly, the door was wrenched open and armed men surrounded the vehicle. "This is outrageous," Margaret exclaimed, her voice ringing with aristocratic authority. "I am Lady Margaret Greymore, Countess of Westfield. You will release us immediately." "Our orders concern only Lady Hartley, my lady," the man replied, though he sounded less certain faced with a countess's wrath. "We mean you no harm." "Edmund sent you," Cecilia said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Tell your employer that I will not come willingly." "Then you will come unwillingly," another voice said, and Edmund himself appeared from behind the carriage. "Really, cousin? Did you think I would allow you to marry that meddlesome duke and place yourself forever beyond my reach? You and those troublesome documents of yours have caused me considerable inconvenience. It ends today. You cannot simply abduct women in broad daylight in the middle of London," Margaret protested. "I am retrieving my ward, who has been led astray by unscrupulous individuals," Edmund replied smoothly. "Perfectly legal, particularly given the pending competency hearing. Now, Cecilia, step out of the carriage. I would prefer not to use force, but I will if necessary." Cecilia met Margaret's eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there, but also determination. "If I refuse, then my men will drag you out, and the Countess may be injured in the struggle," Edmund said coldly. "Is that what you want? To add her harm to your list of offences?" "Go," Margaret whispered urgently. "I will get help. Dominic will find you." "Touching faith in the Duke," Edmund sneered. "But by the time anyone realises what has happened, we will be far from London. I have a property in Scotland, quite remote, where a ceremony will take place making you my wife. Once we are married, cousin, all your property becomes mine by law, including those bothersome documents you have used to slander my good name." "I will never consent to such a marriage," Cecilia said, even as 2 of Edmund's men moved forward to seize her arms. She twisted toward the street, drawing breath to shout for help. One of the men caught her wrist, and another leaned close enough for her to smell stale tobacco beneath the scarf that hid his face. "Quietly, my lady," he murmured, as if offering advice rather than committing a crime. Outside, Edmund's followers called out in practiced tones about king's business, creating a thin wall of intimidation that kept curious pedestrians at a distance. Scottish law is wonderfully flexible about such things, Edmund replied, watching her struggle with cool satisfaction. Now come along. We have a long journey ahead. They hauled Cecilia from the carriage despite her resistance. Margaret lunged forward to help, but a broad-shouldered man stepped between them, palms raised as though he were restraining a riot rather than abducting a woman. The movement was swift, rehearsed. Within moments, Cecilia was being forced into a different carriage, this one with barred windows that spoke of careful preparation. "Margaret!" Cecilia called as the door slammed shut. "Tell Dominic!" "I will!" Margaret's voice came back, fierce with promise. "Edmund, you will hang for this." "Empty threats from a woman with no proof," Edmund replied dismissively. Then to his men, "Let the Countess go. She can tell whatever tales she wishes. By the time anyone acts, it will be too late." The carriage lurched into motion, carrying Cecilia away through London's streets. She braced herself, testing the door latch, then the window frames, searching for any weakness. Everything had been built to withstand panic. The doors were locked from outside, and the windows were too small and too reinforced to break. She was trapped. Edmund sat across from her, his expression one of satisfied triumph. "You should have accepted my original proposal, Cecilia. It would have been so much simpler. Now you have forced me to more drastic measures, but the result will be the same. You will become my wife. I will control the Hartley properties, and those documents of yours will be destroyed. Dominic will stop you," Cecilia said, clinging to that certainty. "He has the resources, the authority, the determination to find me." "Perhaps," Edmund conceded, "but I have a 12-hour head start and a well-planned route. By the time your Duke discovers where I have taken you, we will be man and wife under Scottish law. And no English Duke can undo a Scottish marriage once consummated." The cold calculation in his voice made Cecilia's skin crawl. She turned away from him, staring out the barred window at the city passing by, and began to pray that Margaret could reach Dominic in time. Meanwhile, Margaret's carriage raced back toward Mayfair, the Countess shouting at the driver to hurry despite the dangerous pace through crowded streets. Her mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Edmund had made his final desperate gambit, and if he succeeded, all their careful planning would be for nothing. She burst into Dominic's townhouse without waiting for the butler to announce her, racing to his study, where she knew he would be working on correspondence. "Edmund has taken her," she cried, breathless from running. "He ambushed our carriage near Lincoln's Inn. He said something about Scotland, about forcing a marriage. Dominic, we must go after them immediately." Her brother was on his feet before she finished speaking, his face gone white with fury and fear. "How long ago?" 20 minutes, perhaps 30, Margaret replied. They had a fast carriage prepared. He spoke of having a 12-hour lead. Dominic was already moving, shouting orders to his household. "Send word to the stables. I want 6 men ready to ride within the hour, armed and provisioned for pursuit. Alert the magistrates to issue a warrant for Edmund Fairmont's arrest on charges of kidnapping. And send runners to every coaching inn on the Great North Road. I want to know if anyone has seen them." As his staff scattered to execute his commands, Dominic turned back to Margaret. "Did he say where in Scotland?" "Only that he had a property there, somewhere remote," Margaret replied. "Dominic, what if we cannot find them in time?" "We will find them," Dominic said with absolute conviction. "Edmund may have a lead, but I have resources he cannot match." Within the hour, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. A crown messenger arrived at Dominic's townhouse, breathless from riding hard across the city. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing quickly. "I was sent from the Admiralty with urgent news. Captain Raphael Cortez has provided extensive testimony regarding his dealings with Lord Edmund Fairmont. The Admiral thought you should know immediately, given your interest in the case." "What manner of testimony?" Dominic demanded. "Everything, Your Grace," the messenger replied. "Payments, correspondence, detailed orders regarding Lady Cecilia Hartley's abduction. Captain Cortez kept meticulous records of his business dealings, including copies of letters from Lord Fairmont. The Admiral says it is more than sufficient to secure criminal convictions on multiple charges." "When did this testimony occur?" "Yesterday, Your Grace." The documents were being prepared for formal presentation to the courts. Captain Cortez was most cooperative once he understood that his cooperation would result in transportation rather than hanging. Dominic's mind raced through the implications. With Cortez's testimony added to Cecilia's documentation, the case against Edmund was now unassailable. But Edmund must have learned somehow that Cortez had been captured and was talking. This desperate kidnapping was the act of a man who knew his other schemes had failed. "Bring me copies of Cortez's testimony immediately," Dominic ordered. "And tell the Admiral I need a warrant for Edmund Fairmont's arrest, not just for the pirate contract, but for kidnapping, fraud, and attempted forced marriage. I want legal authority to apprehend him anywhere in Britain." "Already prepared, Your Grace," the messenger said, producing a sealed document from his satchel. "The Admiral anticipated your need. This warrant gives you authority to act in the Crown's name." Dominic took the warrant, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. "Tell the Admiral he has my thanks." By late afternoon, Dominic had done what could be done in London. With the Admiral's warrant folded inside his coat and 6 of his most trusted men assembled, he set himself on the Great North Road. Margaret had wanted to come, but he had refused, needing her to coordinate efforts in Mayfair and maintain communication with the authorities. They did not attempt to cover the entire distance in the saddle. Dominic hired post-chaises and paid for fresh teams at every stage, sending men ahead to question innkeepers while the rest rotated between horseback and carriage, sleeping in snatches as the wheels rattled north. It was relentless, expensive, and necessary. By the second evening, they reached a posting inn where Edmund's party had not long before changed horses. "Aye, Your Grace," the innkeeper said, when Dominic described Edmund's party. "They changed horses here perhaps 3 hours ago. The gentleman was most particular about speed. Paid extra for the fastest team I had." "Did he say where he was heading?" "North to Scotland, that much was clear. But he did not specify which route once past the border. 3 hours. Close enough to taste, and still far enough to be dangerous." Edmund was maintaining a punishing pace, but so was Dominic's party. If they could narrow the gap, if they could determine Edmund's exact destination, they might reach Cecilia before he could force his will into law. At the next inn, fortune favoured them. An ostler remembered Edmund's party and mentioned overhearing something about Coldstream, a small border town in Scotland. "Coldstream," Dominic repeated, his mind racing through his knowledge of the area. "There are several isolated estates near there, remote locations perfect for forcing a marriage without witnesses. Can we reach them before he completes his purpose?" one of his men asked. "We must," Dominic replied grimly. "Change horses at every opportunity. I want no delays, not for weather, not for comfort, not for sleep." The last stretch became a blur of frost, darkness, and rattling harness. They pushed through the night in short, savage bursts, stopping only long enough to swap exhausted teams and swallow a mouthful of food. By the time the sky began to pale, the road signs had shifted, and the air had sharpened with the clean bite of the borderlands. Dawn broke grey and cold as Dominic's party thundered along the narrow road leading toward Coldstream. Exhaustion showed in both men and beasts, but Dominic would not slow the pace, driven by a fear he refused to name. At a crossroads 3 miles south of the town, they encountered a farmer driving his cart to market. Dominic reined in long enough to inquire about estates in the area. "There be the old Fairmont place," the farmer said, pointing east toward a line of hills barely visible in the morning mist. "Been abandoned these 10 years or more, ever since the old laird died. Heard tell someone arrived there yesterday afternoon, though. Saw smoke from the chimneys as I passed by." "How far?" Dominic demanded. 5 miles, maybe 6. Follow this road to the stone bridge, then take the track north through the woods. You cannot miss it, though it is a grim-looking place, all shuttered windows and overgrown gardens. They found the property exactly as described. The house was a substantial stone structure that had once been grand, but now showed years of neglect. Smoke indeed rose from several chimneys, evidence of recent occupation. More telling were the 2 carriages in the courtyard, one of them matching the description of the vehicle used to abduct Cecilia. Dominic dismounted, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Surround the house," he ordered quietly. "No one enters or leaves without my knowledge. Captain Morris, you and 2 men come with me. The rest, watch every door and window." They approached the main entrance boldly, making no attempt at stealth. Dominic wanted Edmund to know he had been found, wanted to see the fear in the man's eyes when he realized his scheme had failed. The door was locked, but a single kick from Dominic's boot sent it crashing inward. Inside, the house was cold despite the fires, the air carrying the musty smell of long disuse. Footsteps sounded from above, and then Edmund appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his face draining of colour when he saw who had invaded his sanctuary. "Dominic," he said, attempting to maintain his composure, "this is private property. You have no authority here." "I have this authority," Dominic replied, producing the warrant from his coat. "Edmund Fairmont, Lord of Greenton, you are under arrest by order of the Crown for kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and contract with foreign pirates to commit crimes against British subjects. Where is Lady Cecilia?" "I do not know what you mean," Edmund began, but his words were cut off as Dominic started up the stairs, his expression promising violence. "Do not lie to me," Dominic said, his voice deadly quiet. "You abducted her from a carriage in London 2 days ago, near Lincoln's Inn. My sister witnessed it. You brought her here intending to force a marriage. Now tell me where she is, or I will tear this house apart until I find her." Edmund backed away from the fury in the Duke's eyes. "She is locked in the West Wing. Unharmed, I swear it. I intended no violence, merely to secure my rights as her nearest male relative." "You have no rights over her," Dominic snarled. "You forfeited any claim when you began your campaign of fraud and intimidation. Captain Morris, find Lady Cecilia and bring her to safety. I will deal with Lord Fairmont." As his men moved to search the West Wing, Edmund made a desperate lunge for a pistol lying on a nearby table. Dominic caught his wrist before he could reach it, and the 2 men crashed together in a struggle that had nothing to do with honor or rules of combat. This was raw desperation meeting righteous fury. Edmund fought with the strength of a cornered animal, landing several blows that Dominic barely felt through the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But the Duke was younger, stronger, and motivated by something beyond mere self-preservation. He was fighting for the woman he loved, for justice long delayed, for all the victims of Edmund's schemes. A solid punch to Edmund's jaw sent the older man reeling backward. He stumbled, reaching for the staircase railing, but Dominic was already there, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. "You will confess everything," Dominic said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Every forgery, every theft, every lie you have told. You will face justice for what you have done to the Hartley family and to Cecilia." "You cannot prove anything," Edmund gasped, though the defiance was fading from his eyes. "We have your father-in-law's journals documenting your crimes. We have testimony from Captain Cortez detailing your contract to abduct Cecilia. We have witnesses to yesterday's kidnapping, including my sister, a countess whose word carries considerable weight. And we have you, caught in the act of attempting forced marriage." Dominic tightened his grip. "You have lost, Edmund. The only question now is whether you hang for your crimes or spend the rest of your life in prison." The fight went out of Edmund all at once. He sagged against the wall, his face crumbling as he realized the full extent of his defeat. "I needed the money," he whispered. "The investments I made went bad. I was drowning in debt. The Hartley estates were the only way out." "So you destroyed a family to save yourself," Dominic said with disgust. He released Edmund and stepped back. "Captain Morris will secure you until the magistrates arrive." "Your Grace," came a call from the West Wing. "We have found her." Dominic turned and ran, following the voice down a long corridor to a locked door. Through it, he could hear Cecilia's voice calling his name, and relief flooded through him so powerfully that he momentarily lost his breath. "Stand back from the door," he shouted, then threw his shoulder against it. The lock gave on the second impact, and the door crashed open. Cecilia stood in the centre of a small bedchamber, her hair dishevelled and her dress wrinkled from the long journey, but otherwise unharmed. A bent hairpin glinted on the floor near the door, and the fresh scratches around the lockplate told Dominic she had not spent her captivity waiting helplessly. When she saw Dominic, her composure finally broke. She rushed into his arms, and he held her tightly, feeling her shake with reaction to everything she had endured. "I knew you would come," she whispered against his chest. "I never doubted it." "Always," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I will always come for you." They remained like that for a long moment, before practicality reasserted itself. There were arrangements to be made, prisoners to secure, and a journey back to London to undertake. Edmund was placed under armed guard, and Dominic sent riders ahead to notify the authorities in London of their imminent return. The journey south took 2 days, moving at a more reasonable pace now that the emergency had passed. Cecilia rode in a comfortable carriage with a maid Margaret had sent to meet them at the border, while Edmund travelled separately under close watch. During the journey, Edmund was interrogated by Crown agents who had joined them at Berwick. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of severe punishment, he began to talk, detailing not just his schemes against the Hartley estate, but numerous other financial frauds he had perpetrated over the years. Each confession was carefully documented, building a case that no court could dismiss. They reached London on a grey November afternoon to find Margaret waiting at Dominic's townhouse with news. The scandal of Cecilia's abduction and rescue had spread through society like wildfire. But this time, public opinion was shifting in her favour. The dramatic rescue by a duke riding through the night has captured imaginations, Margaret explained as they gathered in Dominic's study. People love a romantic story, and Edmund's villainy is so clear-cut that even his former allies have abandoned him. You have become heroes in the public eye. I care nothing for public opinion, Dominic said firmly. I care about justice. Fortunately, you shall have both, Margaret replied with satisfaction. The Lord Chancellor has agreed to convene a formal assembly of peers to hear the evidence against Edmund and to address the charges he made against Cecilia. It will be held in 3 days at Westminster. Every member of the House of Lords is invited to attend. The assembly took place in the ornate chamber of the House of Lords, with dozens of peers in attendance. Dominic presented the evidence methodically and thoroughly. First, he displayed the journals kept by Cecilia's father, walking the assembled lords through each documented instance of Edmund's fraud. Then he presented financial records showing the systematic theft of Hartley resources. But the most damning evidence came from Captain Raphael Cortez's testimony. The pirate captain had provided detailed written accounts of his dealings with Edmund, including copies of letters commissioning Cecilia's abduction. The Lord Chancellor read portions of these documents aloud, and a ripple of shock and disgust moved through the chamber. Lord Fairmont engaged in conspiracy with foreign criminals to commit acts of piracy against British subjects, the Lord Chancellor summarised. He falsified documents, stole property, and when his victim attempted to seek justice, he orchestrated her kidnapping with intent to force marriage and thereby gain legal control over the very evidence of his crimes. The Crown finds these actions to constitute high crimes demanding the severest punishment. Edmund, present under guard, said nothing in his defence. What defence could there be against such overwhelming proof? The Assembly voted unanimously to strip Edmund of his title and properties and to recommend criminal prosecution on all charges. He was remanded to custody pending trial, where he would face charges carrying penalties up to and including execution. As for Captain Cortez, his cooperation had earned him transportation to the colonies rather than hanging. The Admiralty announced that the pirate would spend the remainder of his life in exile, a mercy granted only because his testimony had helped bring a more dangerous criminal to justice. With Edmund's defeat complete and Cecilia's name legally cleared, Margaret moved to the final phase of her plan. She hosted an evening reception at her townhouse in Mayfair, specifically designed to reintroduce Cecilia to London society as Dominic's acknowledged betrothed and future Duchess of Northmere. The event was carefully orchestrated. Margaret had called in every favour she was owed, pressuring influential members of society to attend and to treat Cecilia with respect. The result was a gathering that included many of London's most prominent families, though noticeably absent, were those who remained opposed to the match on principle. Cecilia arrived on Dominic's arm, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that Margaret had commissioned for the occasion. Her hair was elegantly arranged, and she wore pearls that had belonged to Dominic's mother, a deliberate signal of her accepted status in the Greymore family. The reception they received was mixed, exactly as Margaret had predicted. Some guests greeted them warmly, congratulating Dominic on his choice and welcoming Cecilia into their circle. Others were coolly polite, offering minimal courtesy, while making their disapproval clear through tone and manner. A few openly snubbed them, turning away or refusing to acknowledge introductions. Cecilia endured it all with remarkable composure, her head held high, her manner gracious even to those who were barely civil. Dominic watched her navigate the treacherous social waters and felt his admiration for her deepen further. She was proving herself worthy of the position not through birthright but through character, and he could see others beginning to recognize it. Lady Pemberton, one of society's most influential matrons, approached them late in the evening. She was known for her rigid adherence to social hierarchy and her power to make or break reputations with a single word. "Your Grace," she said to Dominic, then turned to Cecilia. "Lady Cecilia, I have been observing you this evening with considerable interest. I hope my conduct has not disappointed Lady Pemberton," Cecilia replied calmly. "On the contrary," the older woman said, "you have conducted yourself with dignity despite receiving treatment that would reduce lesser women to tears or fury. That speaks to strength of character." She paused, then added, "I knew your mother many years ago. She was a woman of great grace and intelligence. I see much of her in you." "Thank you," Cecilia said softly. "That is a compliment I treasure above all others." Lady Pemberton nodded, then looked at Dominic. "You have chosen well, Your Grace. I shall make it known that I approve of this match." With that pronouncement, delivered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, she moved away. The effect was immediate. Lady Pemberton's approval carried enormous weight, and those who had been uncertain about how to treat Cecilia suddenly became more welcoming. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably in their favour. "That went better than I dared hope," Margaret said later, as she, Dominic and Cecilia reviewed the evening over tea in a private sitting room. "Lady Pemberton's support changes everything. Others will follow her lead. Some will never accept me," Cecilia observed. "Those whose sense of hierarchy is too rigid to accommodate a viscount's daughter marrying a duke, then they can live with their displeasure," Dominic replied firmly. "I will not apologize for choosing the woman I love over the approval of narrow-minded fools." Margaret smiled. "Nor should you. You have done the Crown considerable service by bringing Edmund to justice. That earns you the right to choose your own bride. And Cecilia has proven she has the strength to fulfill the role of Duchess. The rest is simply noise that will fade with time." In the weeks that followed, Edmund Fairmont stood trial and was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour, his properties and remaining assets seized by the Crown and distributed among his victims. The Hartley estates were fully restored to Cecilia, clear of all fraudulent debts and encumbrances. Throughout this period, Cecilia remained in London, learning from Margaret and beginning to understand the scope of what being a duchess would entail. She met with the stewards of Northmere Estates, reviewed charitable organisations under ducal patronage, and studied the political issues that would require her attention as Dominic's partner. It was demanding work, but Cecilia approached it with the same determination she had shown in fighting Edmund. She would not be a duchess in name only, ornamental but useless. She would be a true partner to Dominic, capable of managing their shared responsibilities with competence and care. As winter settled over London, society's opinion continued to shift in their favour. The romantic story of the Duke who had ridden through the night to rescue his beloved, combined with Cecilia's evident strength of character, had captured public imagination. By the time Christmas approached, even the most sceptical members of society were beginning to accept that the Duke of Northmere had indeed chosen well. "You have proven them all wrong," Dominic told Cecilia one evening, as they stood together in the conservatory of his townhouse, watching snow begin to fall on London's streets. Those who said you could not be a duchess, that the gap between our stations was too great. You have shown that character matters more than birthright. We have proven them wrong together, Cecilia corrected, taking his hand. I could not have done any of this without you. He raised her hand to his lips. Nor I without you. You have changed my life, Cecilia. Made me believe that duty and happiness can coexist after all. They stood together in the quiet conservatory, watching the snow fall and looking forward to the future they would build together. A future hard-won but infinitely precious because of the trials they had overcome to claim it. Part 7. The wedding took place in late January at Northmere, the ancestral seat of the Greymore family. The estate sprawled across rolling hills in Derbyshire, its grey stone manor house dating back 3 centuries. Snow covered the grounds, transforming the landscape into something from a winter fairy tale. Cecilia had insisted on a private ceremony, despite Margaret's suggestions for a grander affair. After months of public scrutiny and scandal, she wanted this moment to be about their commitment to each other, not about society's opinion. Dominic had readily agreed, understanding her desire for intimacy after so much exposure. The guest list was deliberately small. Margaret and her husband, the Earl of Westfield, stood as witnesses. A few close friends from Dominic's university days attended, along with select members of the household staff who had served the Greymore family for decades. Mrs. Brennan, who had become something between companion and friend to Cecilia, wept throughout the ceremony. They exchanged vows in the estate's private chapel, a small stone building with stained glass windows that cast coloured light across the ancient flagstones. The vicar spoke of partnership and mutual respect, themes Dominic had specifically requested. This was not to be a traditional ceremony emphasising wifely obedience, but a union of equals committed to supporting each other. When Dominic placed the ring on Cecilia's finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, she looked into his eyes and saw reflected there all the tumultuous months that had brought them to this moment. Pirates and kidnapping, scandal and vindication, fear and courage. They had weathered storms that would have destroyed most couples before they even began, and emerged stronger for it. I love you, he said quietly. Words meant for her alone, despite the assembled witnesses. Today and always. And I love you, she replied, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. My partner, my friend, my husband. The wedding breakfast was held in Northmere's Great Hall, a room that could accommodate hundreds, but felt intimate with their small party. Cecilia looked around at the ancient tapestries on the walls, the massive fireplace where logs crackled warmly, the long table that had hosted centuries of Greymore celebrations. This was her home now. These responsibilities hers, to shoulder alongside Dominic. You look pensive, Your Grace, Margaret observed, using Cecilia's new title with obvious pleasure. Having second thoughts? Not for an instant, Cecilia replied. I was simply contemplating the weight of history in this place, the generations of duchesses who have walked these halls before me. And every one of them would recognize a worthy successor, Margaret said firmly. You have already proven your strength, Cecilia. Now you simply need to apply it to the role ahead. Over the following weeks, Cecilia immersed herself in learning the complexities of managing a ducal household. The scope was staggering. Northmere alone employed over 200 people, from senior stewards to scullery maids. Beyond that were the tenant farmers on estate lands, the families in surrounding villages who depended on ducal patronage, the charitable institutions supported by Greymore resources. Margaret proved an invaluable guide, visiting Northmere frequently to help Cecilia navigate protocols and expectations. Together, they reviewed account books, discussed personnel matters, and planned the social calendar that would begin in earnest when they returned to London for the parliamentary season. The key is delegation without abdication, Margaret explained one afternoon as they reviewed household accounts in the morning room. You cannot personally oversee every detail of 12 estates, but you must understand enough to ensure your stewards are performing their duties properly. Trust, but verify. It sounds remarkably similar to managing the Hartley estate, Cecilia observed, simply multiplied by a factor of 20. Precisely. You already possess the fundamental skills. Now you are simply applying them at greater scale. Beyond household management, Cecilia began establishing her own charitable priorities. The Hartley estates, now fully restored to her control, provided independent income she could direct as she wished. Working with solicitors and administrators, she transformed her father's properties into a model of progressive estate management. Rents were set at fair rates, repairs to tenant cottages prioritized, and a portion of annual profits dedicated to supporting orphanages throughout the county. "It is what father would have wanted," she told Dominic one evening as they reviewed the arrangements. He always believed that privilege carried responsibility to those less fortunate. Edmund's crimes nearly destroyed that legacy. "I want to rebuild it into something that honors father's memory." "He would be proud of you," Dominic said, drawing her close, "as I am proud to call you my wife." Meanwhile, Edmund Fairmont began serving his sentence in one of England's harshest prisons. Reports filtered back to London about his deteriorating condition. The proud lord reduced to hard labour alongside common criminals. Some in society expressed sympathy, suggesting the punishment was too severe. But most, including Cecilia, felt justice had finally been served. "I do not wish him dead," she told Margaret when the subject arose. "But neither do I wish him free to harm others. He made his choices, and he must live with the consequences." As winter gave way to spring, Cecilia and Dominic returned to London for the parliamentary season. Society's reception was notably warmer than it had been months earlier. Lady Pemberton's continued support had influenced others, and Cecilia's dignified conduct during her first months as Duchess had impressed even skeptics. She accompanied Dominic to political dinners and receptions, not as ornamental decoration, but as active participant. Her intelligence and thoughtful opinions on social issues earned respect from politicians who had initially dismissed her as an unfortunate match for the Duke. Soon, she was receiving invitations to join charitable committees and social reform organisations, positions that allowed her to effect real change. "You have become a force in your own right," Dominic observed with satisfaction after one particularly successful evening where Cecilia had convinced several influential ladies to support expanded education for working-class children. "They listen to you not because you are my wife, but because you speak with knowledge and conviction." "That was always the goal," Cecilia replied, "to be a partner, not a dependent, to contribute meaningfully, not simply occupy a title." Through it all, Margaret remained a constant presence and friend. What had begun as the Countess fulfilling family obligation had evolved into genuine affection. The two women spent hours together, discussing everything from estate management to politics, to their hopes for the future. "I never had a sister," Margaret confessed one afternoon as they walked through the gardens of Dominic's London townhouse. "But if I could have chosen one, I would have wanted someone exactly like you." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Cecilia replied warmly. "I do not know how I would have survived these months without your guidance and support." As summer approached, Cecilia began experiencing symptoms she initially dismissed as stress or changes in diet. But when the fatigue persisted and her courses failed to arrive, she consulted a physician who confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was with child. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and trepidation. A child would be heir to the Northmere title, a weighty responsibility for someone not yet born. But beyond titles and succession, this child would be the product of love between her and Dominic, tangible proof of the partnership they had built. She told Dominic that evening in the privacy of their chambers. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break, his eyes suspiciously bright. "We are going to have a family," he said, wonder colouring his voice. "An actual family." "You sound surprised," Cecilia teased gently. "I spent so many years convinced I would never marry, never have children," he explained. "The obligations of the title seemed incompatible with domestic happiness, but you have shown me that was merely an excuse, a way to protect myself from vulnerability. You have given me so much, Cecilia, and now this." They shared the news with Margaret the following day, and the Countess's delight was immediate and unrestrained. "I am going to be an aunt," she exclaimed, hugging Cecilia carefully. "Oh, this is wonderful news. Have you thought about names? Where will the nursery be? You must start interviewing nurses immediately. The good ones are engaged months in advance. Perhaps we should allow the child to be born before we plan every detail of their life, Dominic suggested with amusement. Nonsense. Preparation is essential, Margaret replied, already making mental lists. Cecilia, you must be careful now. No more riding, proper rest, the best physicians attending you. I am pregnant, not invalid, Cecilia protested, though she was touched by Margaret's concern. The months of Cecilia's pregnancy passed peacefully. She continued her charitable work and social obligations as her condition permitted, refusing to retreat into confinement earlier than absolutely necessary. She wanted to establish that being Duchess and being mother were not incompatible roles, that women could fulfill multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Near the end of her term, they returned to Northmere for the birth. It was where Greymore heirs had been born for generations, and both Cecilia and Dominic wanted their child to enter the world in the family's ancestral home. Margaret stayed with them through the final weeks, providing both practical assistance and emotional support. When Cecilia's labour began on a mild autumn evening, Margaret remained nearby, offering encouragement during the long hours until finally, as dawn broke over the Derbyshire hills, a child's cry announced the arrival of the newest member of the Greymore family, a son, healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and what would likely develop into his mother's green eyes. He is perfect, Dominic said, holding his son with careful reverence. Absolutely perfect. Have you decided on a name? Margaret asked, peering at her nephew with obvious adoration. Thomas, Cecilia said softly. After my father, Thomas Dominic Greymore, if you agree. Dominic looked at her, understanding the significance of honouring her father's memory through their son. Thomas Dominic Greymore, he repeated. An excellent name for an excellent child. The months following Thomas's birth brought a completeness to their lives that both Dominic and Cecilia marvelled at. They had built something rare, a true partnership founded on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. The obstacles they had overcome, the scandals they had weathered, had forged bonds stronger than conventional society marriages built solely on advantage and alliance. 1 year after their wedding, Cecilia and Dominic walked through the gardens of Northmere on a spring afternoon. Thomas was asleep in the nursery under the watchful eye of his nurse. Margaret was visiting with her husband for the week, and for once they had a few hours of peaceful solitude. I have been working on a proposal for Parliament, Dominic said, as they strolled along a path lined with blooming roses. A comprehensive reform of educational opportunities for children in factory towns. Better schools, limitations on work hours for the youngest children, funding for teacher training. That is ambitious, Cecilia observed. The factory owners will resist any regulation that affects their labour supply. Which is why I need your help presenting it, Dominic replied. Your charitable work with orphanages and schools has given you insights I lack. If we work together, combining my political access with your practical knowledge, we might actually succeed in passing meaningful reform. They spent the next hour discussing strategies, debating approaches, refining ideas. This was what their marriage had become. A genuine collaboration where both partners contributed equally to shared goals. It was everything Dominic had once thought impossible. Everything Cecilia had hoped for, but barely dared to expect. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they paused at a bench overlooking the estate's extensive grounds. Cecilia thought back to the terrified woman who had fled Edmund's schemes aboard a merchant vessel, never imagining that pirate attack would lead to this. Do you ever think about how we met? She asked. How improbable our entire story has been. Frequently, Dominic admitted. If Edmund had not hired Cortez, if the pirates had not attacked, if I had not been on that particular ship at that particular time, our paths might never have crossed. I prefer to think we would have found each other eventually, Cecilia said. Perhaps not as dramatically, but inevitably. Some partnerships are simply meant to be. Dominic took her hand, bringing it to his lips. I am grateful for every improbable circumstance that brought you into my life. The scandal, the struggle, all of it was worth enduring to reach this moment. We have built something worthwhile together, Cecilia agreed. Not just a marriage, but a true partnership. One that allows us both to be fully ourselves while supporting each other's goals and dreams. That is the greatest triumph, Dominic said. Not the defeat of Edmund or the restoration of your family's honour, though those matter. The greatest triumph is that we have created a life together that honours both duty and love, obligation and happiness. We have proven that those things need not be mutually exclusive. As twilight settled over Northmere, they made their way back to the manor house, discussing plans for the coming parliamentary session and the educational reforms they hoped to champion together. Behind them, the gardens gradually faded into darkness, but ahead the windows of their home glowed with warm light, promising comfort, family, and a future they would continue building side by side. Cecilia Hartley had begun as a frightened woman fleeing persecution, armed only with documents and determination. She had become Cecilia Greymore, Duchess of Northmere, a woman of influence and purpose who had transformed loss into strength and scandal into victory. But more than any title or social position, she had become a partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, who saw her as an equal in all the ways that truly mattered. That partnership, built on respect and forged through adversity, would shape not only their own lives, but would ripple outward through the reforms they championed and the example they set, in an age where marriages among the nobility were typically transactions of convenience. They had created something rare and precious, a union of true minds and hearts, a partnership that made both of them stronger than either could have been alone. And as the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Northmere, that seemed the finest legacy they could hope to leave.